our only hope is to recapture the system.
Well, sir, I want to rewind time here a little bit because you're the person we all look to for this educational tool of understanding the Federal Reserve System, how it was implemented. And I'm not asking you to take us through your entire book or the entire story because, again, there's a very savvy audience that's listening to you right now. But please, for those of us with friends and family, and that's 98% of us, that don't know this information and think that we are somehow conspiracy theorists, can you please help us understand how this tyrannical system was snuck past the people in 1913?
Well, sure, I'd be glad to do that. There's no theory here. This is just plain old history, and it's not widely known history. And I'm sure there are people that would just be just as happy as if the history weren't known at all. There's no theory here. The history shows quite clearly the Federal Reserve System was created back in 1910, actually. It was voted into law in 1913, but the thinking and the construction work was all done 3 years prior to that, in 1910, on a private island off the coast of Georgia. It was called Jekyll Island. And it was privately owned by a small group of billionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates. It was a resort island, and it was a beautiful place. You can visit it today and see all their mansions, which have been restored and preserved, and the beautiful clubhouse where they had this meeting in 1910 where they created the Federal Reserve Act. And the reason they did that there is because they didn't want anybody to know who was creating it. And that seems strange, but when you think about it, the Federal Reserve System was sold to the American people back then, and still is being sold today, as a means of controlling the banks, a means of regulating the banks, and protecting the people against the avarice of those big bad bankers on Wall Street. Well, had they known that the Federal Reserve Act was written by the banks, by the very same big bad bankers that people were concerned about, well, they would have then understood that it was a scam, it was a fraud. And so they had to conceal the fact that they were the ones that wrote the bill. When I say they, we're talking about 6 people who represented the biggest banks in the United States with interlocking financial interests with the biggest banks of the world, including the Rothschilds in Europe and the Warburgs in Europe. And we had, the J.P. Morgan Empire and the Rockefeller Empire here. And those are the biggest financial institutions of the time, and they're the ones that wrote the Federal Reserve Act. So that should ring a few bells right there and raise a few eyebrows. We understand there was a great deal of secrecy about the writing of the bill, and a lot of people didn't understand the secrecy because they didn't really understand who wrote the bill and what their interests were. Well, when you look at that history, and as I say, this is not conspiracy theory. This is just plain old history. You can go to Jekyll Island, as a matter of fact, where all this happened, and you can visit the library there, the archives, and most of this stuff is in their filing cabinets. Oh, incidentally, you may find this of interest, but my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is a very good seller there in the bookstore, in the souvenir store.
Ironic, isn't it?
Ironic, isn't it? Yeah. But anyway, the fact is that this is a matter of history, and what they created there is a cartel. They didn't create a government agency. They created a cartel, no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. It just happens to be a banking cartel. But they had to make it look like a government agency. And that's why they passed it into law. They took the cartel agreement after it was all written up. Then they took it back to Washington, and they found some politicians to, introduce it as a law. So what they did is to take a cartel agreement. They took the words off the top that said cartel agreement, and they replaced it with the words that said Federal Reserve Act. And they passed it into law. And that means that everyone, you and I, and all of us have to agree, or rather have to abide, I should say, by the agreement that was written by the banks, or we go to prison because it's in law. And that makes it look like a government agency because if it has the power to send us to jail, and only government can do that, we think. But that's not the case at all. So it's a cartel that's been given the force and effect of a government agency, but it's completely controlled by the private banks. So having said that, and this is a short version of it, it should come as no surprise when you look at the scene today And every time the banks get into trouble, what happens? Congress dutifully comes into action and votes another $1 trillion or $7 trillion, and the money is created out of nothing by the cartel, the banking cartel, the Federal Reserve Act, and it's given to whom? Well, to the banks, of course. It's given to the banks or to the big debtors that owe money to the banks and are having trouble making their monthly payments and making their interest payments. So everything that the Federal Reserve does, backed up by the Federal Reserve Act and making it legal, always benefits the banks. This is for the banks, of the banks, and by the banks. And it should come as no surprise once you understand its history and the fact that it is nothing more or less than a banking cartel.
The national debt rises. 1933, $22 billion, and up it goes. Down go employment and earnings. 1937, the mounting debt has its impact on our struggle to recover from the Depression. Factories close, unemployment, unrest. But the debt continues soaring, up to $40 billion, to $45, and now on its way to $49 billion. Such a debt, created by wasteful and reckless spending, today makes more difficult our job of paying for the national defense we need.
All right, and to be absolutely clear for those of our family and friends that might be taking their precious time to listen to something as important as this, most will choose to watch Dancing with the Stars, sir. Help me understand what that means to the generation now that is so far removed from that history that they can't even begin to understand it. They don't know that Andrew Jackson fought against these same people. They don't know that Abraham Lincoln fought against these same people. They have no understanding of how wealthy these powers are. These are powers and wealth that far supersede the wealth of a Warren Buffett or a Bill Gates, which is one generational wealth without the license to print money out of thin air. First of all, how do we help people understand the gravity of our situation, number one? And number two, how do we possibly begin to fight against this thing?
Well, I don't know how we get people to understand it unless they want to. If they want to, it's a simple matter. But unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion in my older days that there are just a bunch of people out there that don't want to understand. They have been conditioned to think that, well, it doesn't make any difference what you know or what you understand. Somebody's in charge, and they'll take care of us, and that's fine. You know, if they don't take care of us, well, then there's nothing we can do about it. And a lot of people like that. But fortunately, the history of the world is not written by those kinds of people. They're the followers. They'll go along with whatever happens. The people that write history, the people that make things happen, usually is about less than 3% of the population. So I'm concerned about the 3%, not the 97%. I mean, I'd like them all to be, prosperous and happy and free and, not have pain and have pleasure and all that sort of thing. But I know that they're going to follow. And so I've just kind of written them off in the back of my mind. But I'm really interested in those 3%, the movers and the shakers, the people who care about the future. They care about the unborn population of the world. They care about their grandkids and so forth. And so I think those people, you don't really have to make them understand. Just give them access to the information, and they'll grab it. They'll reach for it. They'll recognize it immediately as truth because it answers all of the questions of the modern day. But I think you first started off to ask the question is, what impact does this have on the present generation? Well, the impact it has on people, whether they know the history or not, is pretty profound. And then, in other words, once they understand what's going on, they're going to realize that they are being legally plundered by the banking system and the political system. Yes.
You're right. I just want to interject because my experience has been with folks that are of your generation, whether they're, my parents or my wife's parents, or even a lot of people in my generation, sir, they don't care. It's as though our culture has been neutered of its sense of liberty, and it's as though the sense of what is right and what is wrong has been removed from the heart of what made America America. It doesn't matter that the banks were given trillions of dollars in 2008. Just as long as the Dow goes up, people are happy. They're fat and happy in their retirement accounts. I have a neighbor and a buddy of mine who works for UBS. He makes $500,000 a year, and he doesn't really understand the first thing about the Federal Reserve. But what's worse is that he doesn't care. because
well, that's my point.
He's fat and happy, and it's so frustrating, sir. I mean, what happened to the heart of this country? Thanks for watching part 2 of my interview with G Edward Griffin. Click here for part 3.